Okay, the first technique we're going to talk about is the squat technique, or some people refer to it as the jam technique in our cover two, defense. And when we talk about squat technique, what I like to do is try to break them down in our techniques down into 7 categories. We'll talk about first the alignment, the stance, the eyes, which get a lot of guys in trouble more so than their footwork, the glide technique, the collision, and then we'll talk about pivot and pop and flattening, which are 2 techniques we use after you get a collision. And then, of course, the most important, we need to be able to finish. The first one we'll have here is we'll talk about the stance part of it. With stance, we want to make sure we've got our feet shoulder width apart, make sure we're staying within the framework of our body. Again, our weight will be distributed over the balls of our feet. Again, we'll have a slight bend at the knees, a slight bend at the ankles, the knees, and our chest out over the front of our body. And again, we'll have our hands up and we'll have our eyes up, ready to get a collision. In our particular defense, we'll actually start deep and sometimes taxi down to where alignment-wise will be just slightly outside of the number 1 receiver, and will be anywhere from 5 to 7 yards deep, depending on that distance. As far as depth, will fluctuate from game to game. Now, as far as the first thing, we already talked about the alignment. We talked about the stance. Now the other thing is our eyes. Okay, initially in our jam technique, our eyes will be back inside. We're reading in man on the line of scrimmage, and then once we read run or pass from the in man on the line of scrimmage, now our eyes go back to the number 1 receiver who we're responsible for collisioning, and our eyes are going to be focused on the belt line of that receiver's. And that's where we want to keep our eyes focused to get the best collision we possibly can. Now, once we establish the alignment, the assignment, once the receiver releases and we want our eyes right there on that hip, now we'll work our glide technique to make sure we keep as much frontal position on the wide out as we possibly can. Ideally, we like to keep an outside-in relationship to collision the receiver back inside, but it's not always possible to keep an outside-in position on the wideout, just because when they try to release, they could get us in a position that's not outside in. But the most important thing is to make sure we continue to keep as much frontal position on them so we can get a collision. So now here you see him working the glide technique. Receivers tries to push him outside. He glides, he keeps his frontal position, keeps his outside in position. Once he gets to him, now we're going to work our collision. We want to make sure we collision him inside as far as we possibly can without taking him too far. Now, once we get a collision on the receiver here, now our eyes go back inside to find our number 2 receiver. Once we control him, now if there's no threat of 2, now we're going to be ready to what we call pivot and pop, which we'll go to on some of the other video that's coming up. It's a good view of it here. Again, the only thing I would like is hands up a little more, ready for the collision. Good stance, good start. Base is probably a little bit wide, but it's a nice job with the glide, nice job of staying square and keeping a nice frontal position to fall back in and get a collision on the receiver. Same thing, taxi down. Again, good stance, good start. Eyes are in the right place. Receiver proceeds to release outside. Nice job of staying square on his glide. And then once he gets the collision, we get the collision here. Now, with the inside release, we'll refer to it as a pivot and pop. Now we get an outside release on this one. Now we call this, we want to flatten and sink. And the reason we give them 2 different names is because the inside release, we may not get as much hands on them, so we would rather than pivot and pop and get back into the window. Here with an outside release, we definitely want to flatten the receiver. We want to flatten him and get him as wide as we possibly can and control him. Once we get to this point, we've flattened him, we've controlled him. Now we can get our eyes back inside, find the number 2 receiver, and once we get control, now we can flatten and sink in the window, which he does a great job of here. Nice job with his feet on the glide and not crossing over. And again, when we glide, we want to make sure we lead with that near foot, which he does here. Great job with the collision. Probably could get a little more extension on him with the hands, but he widens as far as he possibly can, and then he'll pivot and sink into the window. End zone view of it. You can see he does a nice job with his feet. You definitely can't be lazy with your feet as he proceeds to release outside the receiver. We got to make sure we do a nice job of gliding and staying in position till we get nice frontal position and making that wide out go around. And he does a nice job of widening him, and now he sinks. Good stance, good start. Does a nice job of being patient on the release. Now we get an inside release. So here will be a nice pivot and pop. He'll control the receiver once he gets control of him. Nice job with his hands. Probably would like his hands to be a little more inside with those thumbs up. Presses him inside. Once he controls him for about 2 to 3 steps, now he'll be ready to pivot and pop. And again, once you pivot and pop, we give him a landmark of trying to get back outside the numbers into that 10 to 15 yard range where he can get in that window, which is the weakness of cover 2. Nice job there. Again, end zone view where you can get an idea of seeing his eyes. Eyes are inside. He reads pass. Eyes go back to the wide out. Does a great job, even with the receiver trying to give him a little wiggle here. He's a great job of being patient with his feet and keeping that frontal position where he can get nice hands on him. Probably like to stay square just a little bit longer, but he does a nice job of getting his hands on him. Doesn't cross over. The only thing right here, once he gets into the release here after the collision, probably like to see him lead with that left foot a little more to where he doesn't get in a crossover position, but he does a nice job with his hands. Okay, here in a full skelly, we'll start down here at the bottom, 23. He gets a hard inside release. Again, pre-snap, what we'll tell the guys is we tell them that there's like a fence, 3 yards inside of them, 3 yards outside of them. And if the guys release outside of those landmarks, then we'll be ready to either flatten, sink, or we'll be ready to pivot and pop. He gets a hard inside release. He takes his 2 or 3 shuffles to get to him. He can't get to him. So now the receiver's basically done his job for him by going in there really hard. And now since he's gone, the receiver's already done his job for him, now his eyes will find number 2. Number 2's vertical, so now I'm going to be ready to pivot and pop and get back into the window. Ideally, the ball's thrown the other way. We like the DB at the bottom of the screen, number 23. We like him to actually pivot and pop a little bit deeper. I think he sees the ball thrown here, but he still wants to shoot for his landmark outside the numbers. Defensive back up top, number 8. Again, he taxis down. Eyes are inside, ball snap, it's pass, eyes go back to 1. 1 gives him a hard inside release. Again, he takes his 2 to 3 shuffles to get his hands on him. He can't get to him. Now he's going to be ready to pivot and pop and get back into the window. Again, the defensive back up top does a much better job of getting back to his landmark. He'll pivot and pop with the inside release, working back outside the numbers. And again, he'll try to get into that 15-yard window to where he can lift the throw. He doesn't necessarily want to go cover the corner route by number 2 because he's still responsible for anything that comes back in the flat late, which we get a little snag route here by the number 1 receiver, so the ball goes back into the flat. So the corner does an excellent job of keeping his vision back, and he does a good job of being in the window on the corner route. Ball's thrown underneath, he drives on it. Okay, we'll start down here at the bottom. Again, we get a hard outside release. We get a little bit of a crossover here, which we really don't want. If he has to shuffle and he can't get to him within 3 steps, really, with this release, he can go ahead and be ready to pivot and pop and still get in the window. But he crosses over a little here to kind of overemphasize getting his hands on him. Don't really want him to cross over as much as he does here, but he does get to him. But he does a nice job of recovering and pivoting and popping and getting in the window. He gets to his landmarker, which is outside the numbers, which is really good. So now he's in the window. The only thing I would say is just make sure he doesn't cover him too much, because now if something comes back in the flat late, he needs to be in that window. Up top, we get basically a bunch formation up top, so it kind of changes the rules here where we're playing that number 1 receiver more like a wheel route, which will carry that through the zone. So the corner up top actually takes the vertical. Okay, we'll start up top. Again, he taxis down to about 5 to 6 yards, and his vision now goes from the end man on the line of scrimmage to number one. He doesn't really have a number two threat, so he can really be hard on one. We get a quick slant here, and the corner does a nice job of staying square, reading the route, and squeezing and flattening this slant route back towards the line of scrimmage. Does a nice job of knocking it down here. As you can see, once he taxis up, his stance and his initial glide is really good. His eyes are good. They stay focused on one. Ball's thrown. He squeezes, does a nice job of knocking it out.